Hello and welcome to Indianomics. Indian households are seeing their savings dwindle and debt burden rise. That's according to the latest Reserve Bank of India report. It says household savings in FY23, the just ended financial year, has declined to the lowest level in 47 years to 5.1%. At the same time, household liabilities are rising. That is, household borrowing is at the second highest level since independence at 5.8% of GDP. So what does this mean for the economy? If net savings, household savings are going to dwindle so much, who finances the fiscal deficit? And is there a problem with the households themselves in terms of unsustainable debt? To answer these and other questions, I have with me an elite panel of economists. I have with me Nikhil Gupta, the chief economist at Motilal Oswal Financial Services, whose recent book, The 8% Economy, discusses exactly this, the household incomes and their lack of savings. Abhishek Upadhyay, the senior economist at ICICI Securities Primary Dealership, has also written on this point, and Rathin, Managing Director, Overseas Development Institute, a veteran observer of the Indian economy. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Nikhil, to you first. Since you have, analyzed this at length in your book, this latest number kind of vindicates your worry. You think that we are at some perilous level of household savings falling?
Hi, Lata. Yes, so the fall in financial savings to 5.1% is definitely shocking to even me. We were expecting close to 6%, which in itself would have been a 3-decade low number. But 5.1% is even worse than what we were expecting. Now, what it means is we know that inflation was very high in FY22, FY23. And one of the questions that was on everybody's mind was, despite higher inflation, why is consumption not being affected? And now we know the reason. It was not the consumption which got affected. In fact, consumption growth was maintained last year. But most of the burden was taken by financial services, which, as you just mentioned, has fallen to 47-year low in FY23. I'll also mention on household borrowings that you talked about. The key reason why household net financial savings have fallen to 5% is because household borrowings were at 5.8% of GDP in FY23, which is compared to just 4% in the previous few years and the second highest in almost the last 70 years. Now, what it means is that individuals are borrowing more to finance their investments, could be their housing purchases, or to finance their consumption. Now, when we look at household debt, we know that out of total debt of almost 37.5% in FY23, only about 1/3 of that debt is on account of housing. The remaining 2/3 of debt is on account of consumption. And we know that over the last few years, on an average, or in FY23 as well, the non-housing debt has increased at a faster pace than housing debt for the entire household sector. So the fact that households are maintaining their consumption, there is no doubt higher consumption is maintaining GDP growth. It is supporting GDP growth. When households borrow and invest in real estate, it is supporting GDP growth. But at the same time, it is happening at the cost of financial savings. It is happening at the cost of higher debt of the household sector, which is more and more moving towards the non-housing sector. So the sustainability of this kind of growth is definitely a question. So even if it is good in the short term, from a medium to long-term perspective, it is definitely a concern.
Okay. I want to understand the macro implications for growth, but I will come to that in the next round. Abhishek, the immediate worry is that if people are running down their savings, households, then are we going to reach or hit another cycle of NPAs? Is that the immediate worry?
Well, so first, Lata, I agree with what Nikhil said, that this sharp increase in household liabilities raises question mark about the sustainability of private consumption as a driver of growth as we look into the latter part of this fiscal and next year, when we know exports are going to weaken. Also, in this period, there are doubts about private capex recovery, whether it will recover in the next few months. In our view, it will still take some time for private capex to recover. Clearly, headwinds to consumption raise some worries about the growth outlook. I do agree, however, that these variables you look more from a medium-term standpoint rather than from a near-term perspective. It is possible that the household debt levels that we have currently are still not close to that threshold level of debt where households really start to curb their demand. And we know studies such as from institutions like BIS have indicated that this threshold is close to 60% of GDP. It will vary across countries, could be lower for India, but still it is possible. We are not at levels where maybe immediately there is big reason to worry. What gives me some comfort here is though that despite the net financial assets for households coming down so low, overall CAD to GDP was still 2% last year. So that is well within bounds which you consider sustainable, and from a national balance sheet perspective, still not worrying. But on your question about bank NPAs, I think what is a relief here is that a lot of this flow is coming from banks rather than from NBFCs that we saw post demonetization, which ultimately culminated into NBFC crisis, and that had a knock-on effect on private consumption. At this stage, I will not worry given bank balance sheets, but yeah, from medium-term perspective, would be a concern.
Okay, no, it's good that you said that current account deficit has not risen, because I do want to get to the macro picture, but I'll just settle the micro picture first before I toss the macro to Rathin. Nikhil, is there a worry in the micro picture in terms of households borrowing too much? See, ours is actually, in terms of cross-country comparisons, under-leveraged households. Foreign households are much more leveraged. But when you rise so suddenly, part of it can be digitization, and to some extent, Abhishek seems to have, is hinting at that because there are better digital products, maybe microfinance companies that are able to lend better, banks are able to lend better to households. But it's risen suddenly. So do you think there is a more micro financial instability problem with respect to over-lending to over-indebted households?
So Lata, there is no way we can answer that question because there is absolutely almost no data to understand the profile of these borrowers. We don't know their income profile. We don't know what kind of wealth they hold. And even when we look at the breakup of banks' personal loans, which is a part of household sector, we know that almost 1/3 of the increase in personal loans in the past 1 year has been on the account of something called others. Now that others could include a host of factors, but my understanding is, yes, it is very sudden. Yes, it is a sharp rise, but it may not immediately lead to a concern on NPAs as you are highlighting. I still believe if that has to happen, probably it may take some more time to happen. But again, it is very difficult to answer that question because we do not have any details as to the profile of these borrowers. We don't know if these borrowers are new borrowers, if the same borrowers are borrowing more. Very difficult to answer this question.
No, I take your point, and I shouldn't overstate by saying NPAs, especially at a time when bank balance sheets are actually looking very good. So maybe it is fintechs, maybe it is P2P lending, maybe it's other kinds of lending which is not at all connected with the stocks that are reporting their numbers. So I don't want to give that fear. I'm just wondering if there is over-lending at some point in some quarters. But now, Rathin, I want you to comment on the micro, but more importantly, the macro question that Abhishek alluded to. If net household savings is only 5.1% that is available for others to borrow, and fiscal deficit is running at 9% in the latest year, are we in some kind of an unsustainability over here?
Well, let me first comment on the NPA issue. NPAs in India don't happen because of poor people. NPAs happen because of rich people, like Subhash Chandra Z and Nirav Modi and people like that. So if these poor households are borrowing and they default, I don't think that the cost to banks is going to be that large because they're not too big enough to fail. So their collateral will be secured and they might commit suicide, but their collateral will be secured, and on the NPA side, it's fine. On the macro side, look at it in the following way. So what is the action now? We're a developing country, presumably, even Mr. Modi. If we are, then we are well below our potential peak level economic performance. We have not reached peak.
Yes.
Those circumstances, to reach peak India, the country has to invest. That investment can come from foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment. But most important, it comes from domestic savings. Government is not saving. Now we discover that households in the net are not saving, right?
Yeah.
Because the total amount of household debt as a percentage of GDP is now exceeding the total amount of savings. And the only consistent saver as such appears to be the non-financial corporate sector. And we know what they do with their money. They go debt-free. They're not investing, right? And that's been happening since COVID.
Yes.
So what you're getting is a classic low-level equilibrium trap in macro terms.
Okay.
The government will be able to borrow simply because it has preemptive access to total savings. It is able to persuade foreign investors yet to come in and, take on rupee debt. And there is scope at the margin for them to do so. And government securities is a reasonable safe bet for a private sector that's not interested in doing anything with the savings it has. So I don't anticipate any kind of funding crisis happening to government, except that, the best will in the world, the revenue deficit being more than half of the total deficit, government also is borrowing to consume. So households are borrowing to consume, governments are borrowing to consume. The private sector is not investing, it's saving instead. That is not a very healthy state of affairs for an aspirationally growing economy, which has already moderated its expectations, I note, from 8% to 7% to 6% of GDP in terms of growth rate. So I think that is the overall situation. I want to make one final comment on consumption borrowing. Unfortunately, there are good and bad kinds of borrowing for investment, there are good and bad kinds of borrowing for consumption. One of the very bad signs of borrowing for consumption is when you borrow to sort of counter life cycle volatility. And that happens when you borrow for healthcare. We know that those numbers are going up quite significantly. Another number, which is small still in the aggregate, but has gone up quite significantly for relatively high net worth households, is borrowing for education. Quite commonplace now that unless you're a very wealthy family, even if your child goes to a domestic MBA type institution, you have to borrow to finance the education. So that is a pile of debt that has macroeconomic implications going forward, which I would worry about. And the low household savings rate also reflects this sort of new kinds of borrowing that are happening as households seek to cope with an increasingly tight job market, lack of opportunities, et cetera, plus volatility caused by an increasingly expensive and broken healthcare system.
Okay. Now, these are some serious conclusions that our experts are drawing. I would want the others also to comment on these macro implications or deductions that we may make from this data that Rathin Roy is pointing to, that if households are slaving at a lower pace, government is just saving, corporate sector is not investing, then are we likely to get trapped in a slightly lower rate of growth than our aspirational 8%? All those questions after the break. Bear with me, gentlemen. I'm back in a jiffy.